and your family and your friends and your sisters and brothers. Stop hurting animals.
Your suffering will change you. Suffering will change you, not just in ways you can anticipate, but in ways that you cannot anticipate. And I've seen that again and again in the study of politics, in the study of extreme politics, to cut to the chase. In university, before September 11th, 2001, before September 11th, I studied politics in the Muslim world. And you saw all the time there would be guys who, at one stage of their career, were relatively moderate, relatively pragmatic, and then they got snatched off the street, put into a ghost house, tortured, and when they came out, their perspective on the world was different. It's not a slippery slope. The role of violence, and again, it doesn't necessarily make people bitter, but it changes people in ways they can't anticipate themselves. If you think the level of hostility and backstabbing and suspicion and hatred that we have within veganism now is bad, I can imagine it getting worse. I think when you mix terrorism into what's already a bad situation, I can imagine it getting worse. But I've studied political history. I can imagine veganism being less like a high school prom and more like the IRA. And I want to stop that from happening. But I know that there are people, and I've met and spoken to people, who want veganism to move towards violence, or they personally want to join groups that use violence, precisely because they feel that violence will discipline their fellow vegans, that violence will bring a form of seriousness and earnestness to the movement, or to their group, their cell within the movement.
Certain groups of individuals who will not listen to reason, and for that, you need violence.
They want the secrecy and seriousness and self-discipline that violence will bring, that the fear of state repression will bring. They want the simplicity and clarity of purpose that hostility towards the government will bring, whether they're in England or in the United States or Canada. I understand that. Emotionally and intellectually, I understand that. But I'm here to tell you sincerely that you're wrong. And you're not just wrong because getting on that path will put you in a cage, will put you in prison. You're wrong in your means, in your motives, in the ends that you're going towards. You're wrong in the way that you're going to transform the activist group you're a part of, the type of hostility, suspicion, etc. I've already described. And you're wrong because you don't know how suffering will change you. You don't. You think you're not a killer, but you could be. You could become one. You think you're someone who won't rat out your friend to the cops, but you could be. You could become that person. Or you think you wouldn't kill someone who's currently your friend because they ratted you out to the cops, or they ratted out another member of your activist group to the cops. But you could be. You don't know how suffering will change you. One of the turning points in the history of this YouTube channel was when I pointed the finger clearly and directly at another vegan activist, well-known vegan activist from Detroit, Gary Yourofsky, and said, this is terrorism. What he's calling for is violence. Legally speaking, it's terrorism, and it's not acceptable, and I'm not going to make excuses for it, and neither should you. There are definitely people who are still in the audience today watching who first discovered this channel and first figured out really who I was and what it was all about at that moment when I pointed the finger at Gary Yourofsky. And I had quotations from Gary Yourofsky to back up those allegations that were as plain as day. I'm not going to put the quotation in this video because if you've been watching this channel, you've already heard them 10 times over. But I had a quotation of Gary Yourofsky, for example, of him saying out of his own mouth that he felt that the ALF, a terrorist organization, that the ALF were not violent enough. Played that clip many times. I had a clip of him directly saying that he thought the time would soon come when people would actually be using guns, really carrying out violent terrorist activity in slaughterhouses in the name of veganism. Even when the message was that clear, the vast majority of vegans, the vast majority of people who saw those YouTube videos, both on my channel and where they first appeared with Gary Yourofsky speaking from his own perspective, the vast majority of vegans just didn't see the problem with it. I got so many messages from people saying, wow, I heard that before, and somehow the excuse-making mechanism in my mind was just so strong that I didn't really see the problem with it. And that's exactly what I want to draw your attention to here. The problem is not forms of terrorism that openly and overtly declare themselves as such. The problem is the way in which individual people and a whole movement engages in or indulges in the excuse-making mentality. Step by step, like the so-called boiling frog syndrome, people become accustomed to certain justifications, certain rationalizations, certain assumptions. They maybe even redefine what the word violence means. What is and what isn't violence? That was part of Yourofsky's game too. They define what activism means. They define what their objectives are. They define what sacrifices they're willing to make in such a way that not only is a minority of the movement drawn into outright terrorism, but what's worse, the majority of the movement is implicated in it. The majority of people are discredited by it. The majority of people in the movement, who doubtless are not terrorists and don't think of themselves as supporting terrorists, they nevertheless, step by small step, end up creating a kind of smokescreen for the worst elements of the movement to act out their revolutionary fantasies. So in this video, I'm going to talk about two examples that are certainly much, much less obvious than Gary Yourofsky directly advocating for violence. Gary Yourofsky directly saying the ALF is not violent enough. But they're all the more important to deal with, not despite that reason, but because of it.
We're standing outside of the mansion of the owner of Fearful Slaughterhouse, and we live in such a sick, deluded society that we have this police officer right here who came up to the speakers and actually DJ'd to turn the volume down because he believes the right thing to do is to protect the tranquility of the wealthy. And he believes that taxpayers' dollars ought to go to his actions to make sure that these people live in peace, while the screams of these animals go forgotten and unheard by the perpetrators and by the people here who are trying to honor them and share the message and share their voice and have them heard. So society needs to understand that the people protecting you and the law do not care about the vulnerable, do not care about the innocent, because if they did, they would be protecting the innocent. Instead, the priority of the status quo, the priority and the narrative is to keep the tranquility of the violent, wealthy business owners who cause bloodshed and suffering and get all of us to shut up and go home. But we're not going to shut up. We're not going to go home. We're going to come back. And I would like to see 10,000 people here to honor the 10,000 plus pigs that are slaughtered and scream like that every single week at Fearman's Court. Yes. So we're coming back and we're going to be louder and louder and louder until it ends. Because if these were dogs, everyone would be here. But because of speciesism, there's nothing but suffering and violence and bloodshed and terror and fear. And we will be back again and again and again until you and your family and your friends and your sisters and brothers stop hurting animals.
You think this is a minor thing, but it's not. You think that police keeping the peace, order, and good government, you think that's a minor thing, but it's not. You think that the difference between having a social movement where nobody is afraid of the police and a social movement where everybody is afraid of the police, where everyone is afraid that they're going to be ratted out to the police because everyone's implicated in illegal activity. You think that's a small or subtle difference? It's not. All right? And these are the kinds of presentations of ideas that are so subtle. I mean, what she's calling for here doesn't sound anything like terrorism. And there's a second example I want to bring in here. I'll come back to Aaron Janister real quick. But, there was a YouTuber here. He's a critic of what's going on in the movement, the good, bad, and the ugly. And he made this case that sounds so appealing. He made this case for extending disruption to disrupt the supply chain. That's how he put it. To directly tackling, like specific slaughterhouses, the animals being shipped to the slaughterhouses and being shipped from the slaughterhouses after they've been killed and so on. That, if you could just set up these disruptions to the supply chain in a focused way, in a legal and slightly violent way, that like somehow you'd cause the price of pork to go way up in a particular city because of these disruptions. You're messing up the industry enough. Yeah. But you know what? That's not all you're messing up. You're putting yourself in a situation where now the police are not your friends. They're your enemies. And then we're people within the movement. Each one of us is hostile to and afraid of the others. Can I trust you? Can you trust me? Because you all know that what you're doing is illegal. You're implicated in something illegal. And then step by step, that experience and that sorrow and that isolation, it changes people. And they may not have started out advocating terrorism. They may have started out just advocating crimes against property and disruption and disrupting the supply chain and so on. But guess where it takes you, and guess where it takes the whole movement. I'm serious here. You may think it's cute and it's harmless for Aaron Janis to endorse the strategy of playing a sound recording of pigs screaming while they're executing, playing that at a high enough volume that it ruins everybody's day in the neighborhood, that all the houses in that neighborhood, nobody can sleep or nobody's kids can play in the backyard because there's this horrible noise playing of pigs being executed. Would you agree that that's a good tactic for any ideology other than your own? Would you make that excuse for any cause, any political organization that you do not happen to sympathize with, that you're not a partisan for? Gee, you know what? You may viscerally feel the way Aaron Janis does. You may be willing to weep and scream about this. You may feel, hey, there are lives on the line. There are people dying. You know what? Not the only cause that's true of. How would you feel if you were walking through a Jewish community and there were anti-Israel protesters, whether they were pro-Palestinian or pro-Syrian or something, and these people wanted to play at deafening volume, play at a high volume, sound recordings of bullets going off and bombs going off and people screaming and people dying. That was their form of protest. They were maybe in front of a synagogue or in the middle of a Jewish neighborhood. This is what they wanted to do, to shock people, using exactly the same reasoning Aaron Janis used there. You could quote what Aaron Janis said verbatim and just replace a few nouns and have a justification for this, right? How about the opposite? What if it was a group of pro-Israel protesters in a Muslim neighborhood? What if it was a group of pro-Israel protesters in front of one of those apartment buildings in Toronto? There are many. One of those apartment buildings that's all Palestinians. It's not quite a whole neighborhood, but still. Or in front of a mosque. And they want to play the audio recording of the sorrow and the misery and people screaming and dying. They have an audio recording of Palestinian terrorists bombing, shooting, and killing Jews in Israel. They want to shock people with that suffering. Are you comfortable with that tactic? No? I mean, the type of excuse-making mentality going on here is exactly the same as a Christian who will make elaborate excuses for what's wrong with the Bible. They'll make excuses for slavery in the Bible. They'll make excuses for all kinds of incoherent things that don't make sense in the Bible. You can just try to stop them and ask, why is it you only make these excuses for this one book? You'll do this for the Bible, but you won't make the same excuses for the Quran, for Muslims. You won't make the same excuses for Hinduism or Buddhism. You're capable of seeing this as something wrong or bad when it's not your religion, when it's someone else's religion. You're capable of seeing what's really wrong with this kind of activism when it's Muslims protesting against Jews or Jews protesting against Muslims, but you can't see what's wrong with it when it's you, when it's your beliefs, when it's your own ideology. You can't have that detachment and sympathy and analysis. You can't appreciate that what that police officer was doing was 100% correct, that he was keeping the peace, that the question really is, how can we all live in a society together where we have profoundly contrasting and conflicting interests, where some of us feel this is a crisis, this is an emergency. Some of us want to shake others out of their indifference. Vegans are not the only ones. These tactics people are endorsing. Okay, so let's say you endorse disruption. You endorse disruption of the supply chain. Real quick contrast here. Would that be a good tactic if what you're trying to do long term is create a society in which nobody smokes cigarettes? Would you endorse disruption of the supply chain or outright terrorism against, the trucks that bring the tobacco back and forth from the tobacco farm to the factory or whatever, and then from the factory to the city? Would you try to disrupt the tobacco industry so that, temporarily the price of cigarettes goes up, and I guess the newspapers would all be complaining, gee, there are these anti-tobacco activists engaging in illegal methods that are screwing up the industry? Would you endorse that? Just think through the next steps on a human level. Then the police become your enemies. Police get involved. What you're doing is criminal. The whole organization becomes paranoid. Same way the IRA was. Most people who remembers the IRA, it's the Irish Liberation Movement, Irish terrorist movement. They weren't afraid of the cops. They were terrified all the time of other people inside the organization. That's the kind of fear they all live with. The brutalization of your movement because you're engaging this, but ultimately also that the type of suasion you're using is irrelevant to what it is you want to achieve. What are these people trying to abolish cigarettes? What do they want to achieve? They want other people to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. They want other people to get informed and get motivated to quit smoking. They don't want to just temporarily raise the price of cigarettes and antagonize the whole of society against them, including the legal system. That's not ultimately what you want to do. Anti-tobacco activists, ultimately, they want the government to adopt laws and public education programs that'll really tell people, hey, you've got to quit smoking. That'll inform children in schools, don't use tobacco, don't use cigarettes. This is what vegans want also, guys. I'm sorry, if you can't follow the argument here, what vegans want is for schools to stop serving bacon and stop serving hot dogs. You want schools to educate children that no, milk is not healthy, eggs are not healthy. In the past, we thought these things were healthy. And just now, progress of science, we know they're not. We want schools to educate children. Hey, you know what? In the past, we thought hunting animals meant that you were brave and strong. And today, we really have to change our mindset that raising millions of animals in captivity and torturing them to death, this is not for the good of society. It's not for the good of our health. It's not for the good of anything. We want public outreach and education. We want public policies. And yes, sure, ultimately, in the same way that the final end goal of the anti-tobacco activists probably is to make cigarettes completely illegal, even if it's 300 years from now, probably, yeah, sure. You know what? The ultimate fantasy of the vegans is that we convince the government to make leather illegal, to make veal illegal, step by step, for meat and dairy to become illegal, or so strongly discouraged by, punitive taxes and what have you, that it really becomes something marginalized and despised society. How could you possibly get there for anti-tobacco activism, or for, say, anti-alcohol activism, or for vegan activism? How could you possibly get there through violent disruption of the supply chain? It's so stupid. And it sounds good, but it's a smokescreen over terrorism. This is step by step what leads people into terrorism. How about Catholics who are pro-life, who want to protest against abortions? Do you think they start off with the mentality that what they're going to do is terrorism? No. They go into it step by step in this same way They think through a rationalization, just like Aaron Janis is doing here, just like the other guy did with, concocting this idea about disrupting the supply chain. They start off with the redefinition of the meaning of familiar words. Violence doesn't sound like violence anymore when you call it disruption. Things that are illegal come to be justified again and again because, after all, animals are dying, people are dying. These languages used to create an us versus them, dichotomy and struggle, which Aaron Janis is doing there also. Step by step, people come up with justifications. They get involved in illegal activity. They say, "Oh, it's not violence against people, quote unquote. It's just violence against property." Right? That's what Gary Yourofsky is always preaching as the baby steps towards outright terrorism. They engage in creating this smokescreen. And sure, it's partly to deceive others, but it's also to deceive themselves. And step by terrible step, those people who probably started off with the loftiest of principles imaginable, and certainly in their own eyes, they had good intentions. Those people, would you ever make the excuses for pro-life activists, for anti-abortion activists? Would you make the excuses for what they're doing that you might hypothetically be making already now for vegans engaged in disruption, for vegans engaged in illegal and violent activities in the name of veganism? I don't think any of us... How do you feel when you walk past pro-life protesters who are genuinely trying to disrupt abortion clinics, who are trying to stop people going into hospitals and going out of hospitals? And this kind of, how do you feel if they're trying to stop an ambulance going in the back door? All these things they try to stop, and you know where it leads. You know how step by step those people, and if government repression makes it worse. As I said at the beginning of this video, the one thing you don't know is how your own suffering will change you. Once you get involved with this kind of activism, once you get involved with this kind of social scene and this excuse making, once you've already had your turn doing a hunger strike at the slaughterhouse, once you've had your turn immersing your arms in liquid concrete, once you've had your turn being arrested for chaining yourself to machinery, once you've been in and out of jail a few times for disrupting the supply chain or for stealing animals from a farm or a slaughterhouse, that cycle of suffering, you're doing it because you think it's going to change the world. But much, much sooner than it changes the world, it changes you. It changes who you are, and it changes all too rapidly what your view is of violence, how much you're willing to get your hands dirty, even if it's only to provide a justification for the sacrifices you've already made. Looking back at history, there were a lot of people with good intentions who made excuses for communism. Let's narrow it down. There were so many well-intentioned left-wing people who made excuses for the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. There were so many people who thought they had pious humanitarian reasons for making excuses to support the mass murder of innocent people by communist regimes, including the communist regime in Cambodia. And afterwards, when all the excuse making is over and done with, a few decades go by, and then they can look back and say, wow, what we were doing was creating a smokescreen for violence. They might have even thought of themselves as peace activists. That was the most common thing with communism. They think they're protesting for peace, but in reality, they're providing a justification for and a smokescreen for violence. There's something similarly paradoxical going on here within veganism. And normally, it's much harder to see than it is in the case of an imbecile like Gary Yourofsky pointing his finger and directly calling for guns and violence and terrorism. Most of the time, it's going to be a whole lot harder to discern.
Certain groups of individuals who will not listen to reason, and for that, you need violence. Spare me the bullshit adages about violence begetting violence. It doesn't always beget violence. In most cases, it actually ends violence.
You don't have to be a highly intelligent person to be a great animal activist. I didn't even finish high school, and I haven't gone to university, and I say the same thing over and over and over again.
À-bas-le-ciel.
What is your malfunction? Let's get one thing straight, meatball, face, butt. I work alone, except when I work with Ronaldo, which is all the time.